Well, at this hour, exactly 1 year ago, Vladimir Putin started his illegal, imperialistic, murderous invasion of Ukraine that has fairly and permanently earned Putin the status of war criminal. President Biden's trip to Ukraine this week will take its place in history as one of the most important foreign trips by a president of the United States. He is the second president of the United States to travel to Ukraine while Ukraine was engaged in all-out war. 77 years ago, in the final year of World War II, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt traveled to Ukraine for a summit meeting with our allies. Russia was on our side then. And so the president met with the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Most of what they discussed that week in Crimea in February 1945 was about what they hoped to establish after they won the war, which they correctly believed would be soon. Joseph Stalin never traveled outside of the Soviet Union during the war and outside of the protection of his own troops. And so the meeting had to occur in a place that was under Soviet control. Russian forces, which included millions of Ukrainians, had driven Nazi Germany's forces out of the region when it was there, and there it was then safe to meet there. President Roosevelt had been working on the design of a post-war organization that he was calling the United Nations. In his summit meeting in Crimea, he achieved a general agreement on the outline of how the United Nations would be structured and how it would work, with a Security Council of major nations and a General Assembly of as many nations in the world as they could possibly enlist to join. Today, that institution, which President Roosevelt did not live long enough to see, the United Nations, did exactly what President Roosevelt hoped they would do. Today, the United Nations voted overwhelmingly, 141-7, in favor of a resolution demanding the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine and calling for a lasting peace in Ukraine. 1 year ago tonight, I made it very clear that I was one of the people who was surprised by Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine because it made absolutely no sense. Based on Russia's own experience failing to control Afghanistan, I saw no possibility of Russia being able to completely tame Ukraine. The Northern Ireland model of 70 years of sporadic violence, which frequently turned into terrible violence, was a lesson that I wrongly assumed Vladimir Putin should understand. You can never imperialistically invade and take over and then fully tame a country that doesn't want you there and has enough weapons to kill your soldiers one at a time, if necessary, for decades. But now we know Vladimir Putin understood none of that. He understood nothing about what was going to happen after he invaded Ukraine. Vladimir Putin underestimated the people of Ukraine. He underestimated President Volodymyr Zelensky, and he very much underestimated President Joe Biden. President Biden's management of the complex alliance of nations who have been successfully supporting Ukraine is an achievement comparable only to President Roosevelt's management of the tension-filled alliance that won World War II. At the core, both President Roosevelt and President Biden share the same objective: freedom. Freedom from the oppressive mass murder by war criminals. Vladimir Putin never expected to see Joe Biden walking the streets of Kyiv with President Zelensky 1 year after Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. The Financial Times is reporting that Vladimir Putin is now admitting privately that his military was unprepared. A former senior Russian official tells the Financial Times, quote, "He tells people close to him, it turns out we were completely unprepared. The army is a mess. Our industry is a mess. But it's good that we found out about it this way, rather than when NATO invades us." Of course, NATO was never going to invade Russia. And now President Biden has vowed that Vladimir Putin will never take Ukraine.
President Putin's craven lust for land and power will fail, and the Ukrainian people's love for their country will prevail. Democracies of the world will stand guard over freedom today, tomorrow, and forever. A dictator bent on rebuilding an empire will never be able to ease the people's love of liberty. Brutality will never grind down the will of the free. And Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. Never.
A year ago, Yale history professor Timothy Snyder said this about Vladimir Putin and Russia's lack of preparation.
He's trying to set up a situation where we're supposed to believe that Russia is the victim or the people of the Donbass are the victim, even as he's doing something which is just the brashest and the most awfully direct form of aggression one can imagine. I'm actually struck above all this time by how poorly Russians themselves were prepared for this war.